Merc, Frana. I did it. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Kodiak Shack podcast. Today we have Merc, Frana. I did it, Frana. Yeah, he's had a ton of experience. He got into the military back in 2002, roughly, a little before that. He got into the Strike Eagle, did that for a few years, deployed in the Strike Eagle, and then went to the F-35. So at the 33rd Fighter Wing, he was one of the initial cadre standing up the F-35. Went out to Luke Air Force Base to be a DO and then squadron commander in the 62nd Fighter Squadron. Bender, you got anything to say about that?
Yeah, 357 and counting.
Spike, right on. Love it.
Yeah, there you go. So commander of the 62nd, and then back to Eglin to be the group commander of the 53rd, which is the test group. So we've talked to Slander, we talked to Rex, Wysack. We've talked to a lot of people from the test world, so we just added another one. So Merc, thank you for being here today. Please tell us about yourself.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for that. I really appreciate the beginning of it with Merc's got a ton of experience, just a ton of experience, because it just means that I'm a really old dude that you brought on the podcast. So appreciate that. Yeah, no, I've listened to a couple of podcasts that you've had in the past, and like you said, Rex, Slander, Paco, all those guys I worked with in the 53rd Wing in kind of one capacity or another. But yeah, I guess I joined the military back in 2000, was a graduate of an ROTC program at the University of St. Thomas, went off to pilot training at Shepherd Air Force Base, and then to the B course at Seymour. I did an ops tour there, deployed to Iraq back in 2004, 2005 timeframe, then to the FTU. Actually ended up being DNIF for a little while in the FTU, ended up going to get a master's degree there in North Carolina while I was DNIF and kind of working my way back to flying. And then went out to the 422 after that to fly some Strike Eagle test. That was kind of my first exposure to test and evaluation. I think we'll drill down into some of that here in the podcast. And then was lucky enough to be selected as one of the initial cadre for the F-35. So went back to Eglin, which is where I'm at right now. Living life on the beach, flying fighters was not terrible. Got an assignment out to Luke. Again, pretty awesome assignment out there. I got to stand up F-35 operations, then off to school in DC for a year, and then back down to Eglin. And I mean, I just had a lot of unique and awesome opportunities in the Air Force. Sort of ran out of I guess my family sort of ran out of airspeed, I guess, if you will, and kind of got sick of moving every 2 years and that kind of thing. And so we had moved from Eglin Air Force Base once before, and moving a second time was probably not palatable. So looked to transition out, and now try to do some consequential work for the warfighter, as much as I'm able to as a consultant.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the tough things. I mean, the military just asks you to move around, and you get a lot of great experiences, but your family is just sometimes along for the ride for that. So that's got to be tough. With we've got Bender here, who is our resident F-35 guy, and I am now the fledgling F-15C guy who's making more mistakes than good decisions, but that's all right. That's life. But when you kind of got in the military, what was your long-term plan? Some people have, hey, I want to be a squadron commander or wing commander. Kind of what was your goal when you said, I'm going to fly fighters and?
Yeah, man, great question. I did not have sort of the long-term aspirations when I joined the military. I don't know that I had an and after the I want to be a fighter pilot necessarily. It was sort of man, that looks like a cool way to make a living, to do something, important for my country. Let me, see if it's something, that I can do and can be a part of, and then sort of see where it goes from there. And again, just had a lot of great opportunities. I mean, I think early on I realized that the organization um, is, it's a large organization, it's a large corporation, and ultimately there you have to find a way to differentiate yourself from the masses, one way or another. And a lot of times, as a fighter pilot, that is trying to be as credible as possible. Um, and so, I sort of focused on that and figured the rest of it would take care of itself. And then for me to kind of for a differentiator, I went off and got a master's degree that my leadership really valued, and they were, hugely supportive of. And then a lot of guys that do that program do their time, and then they get out and kind of go into industry. And I stayed around and tried to use the MBA that I got, to better the organization and hopefully the people around me, and try to lead with some humility and make a difference.
Well, I appreciate that, because I think, I always get a little worried when people are like, "Hey, I'm going to be a wing commander," and you're like, "You're not even through MQT, kid." Yeah.
Totally.
Exactly. It makes me a little nervous. So I was in the same boat. Like, I'm gonna, one thing I knew, I was like, I'm gonna fly for 20 years, and the guard, I can still do that. But so one thing I have a question with, and maybe Bender, I know we probably talked about this before, but maybe he's had the same question, is when you're in a Strike Eagle squadron, is it twice as hard to stratify yourself just because there's twice as many rated officers in a squadron? Or is there, like, how does that work? Because you think in a single seat fighter squadron, there's just like, hey, there's 30 of us. But when there's 60 people running around, is that even more mouths to feed with less opportunities, or the same amount?
I think obviously the denominator is twice as big, right? So, but ultimately, the talent level, um, there's no question that the talent is there as well, right? And so, I mean, I don't know, man. I don't know how you guys look at it in your career, but I never really looked at it as a competition, right? I never concerned myself with how that was going to play out. It was sort of, try to be a good teammate, try to be a good wingman, do good things, and hopefully you'll be rewarded for it. But if not, you can look yourself in the mirror and know that you were doing good things, right? So, and even the advice that I guess, again, now I'm kind of all washed up and retired, but when I was active duty, you know, well, I think just like you said, if you have the lieutenant coming through saying, I want to be a wing commander, or I'm going to be the chief of staff or whatever, it's a little bit worrisome. And I think, when people are worried about the stratification aspect of it, or sort of, what's the next step from a career standpoint, like it can kind of cloud your judgment on, what right looks like, I guess. So, just try to be a bro and do what right looks like. Seemed to, I don't know, I guess that served me well.
Yeah.
I
No,
don't know
I
if
think
that answers your
that's a good way to
question
look at it.
at all, actually, but anyway, that's my 2 cents.
But I think
Yeah, I think so.
it's a good way, and you would hope that'd be the case. You'd hope that it's like, hey, the people who are good at their job, they're good dudes. That it's going to work out for them. I remember one of the dudes we were in, Bender and I were in Misawa together with. His advice was always just be a good dude. Like, just be a good dude, and it's probably going to work out in all aspects. Be good at your job, be good in the jet, make reasonable choices, all that kind of stuff. So I'm currently going through a TX right now. So I'm hitting the wrong buttons and saying the wrong things and everything. So how was it transitioning? Obviously you had some experience in the Strike Eagle, moving into the 35. What was that experience like, leaving test and then going to the 35?
Yeah, no, it's funny you say the whole, hitting the wrong buttons and whatnot, because distinctly remember my first sim, and this was before, um, we were there when we had the simulators installed, but we didn't have the syllabus up and running yet. And so kind of as the new guys, you got a chance to kind of go in the sim and fly around and sort of get used to the airplane outside of the syllabus. And I remember the sim tech was like, just take the TMIS and do this and the WEMIS and do that. And I was like, dude, I don't even know what you're talking about. Like, I don't even know
Yeah.
what those switches are. Like, tell me what switch is which. And so I'm sure as you're making the transition from F16 to F15 now, like you're having that same sort of transition, right? Where you're like, why do I have to do this with my with my middle finger on my left hand when I did it with my thumb on my right, kind of thing, previously. But yeah, no, the transition was, honestly, um, it was really a lot of fun. We had a really good group of folks, and we had really good leadership. The leadership did a great job in creating an F-35 community. And, you know, as much as everybody wants to kind of hang on to their baggage, I think, for a while, right? And they want to be like, oh, I was a Strike Eagle dude, or I was a C model guy, or I was a Viper dude. And our leadership did a really good job of saying like, hey man, we're all F-35 guys. We bring different skill sets to the table. And we're building this community from here on out. And that was one of the things that I actually loved about the F-35 community was I think there was a level of humility just kind of resident throughout the community, particularly early on, because you recognize that I didn't know everything there was to know about seed, and I needed experts around me to help me be better in employing the F-35, and the skill sets that I brought from a air to ground standpoint were different than a lot of the Viper guys that had made the transition. So yeah, man, it was a lot of fun. I look back with honestly with great fondness of the transition and kind of my career after that.
Yeah. Bender, you went through the TX much more, or I guess a couple years ago, 3 years ago?
Yeah, a couple years, two and a half or so.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
it is interesting. Yeah, just a couple years. But even now, I feel like things change so fast in the F-35. Probably more so on the tactics side, more than the jet side. But even the jet side, there's always stuff changing. So I can't even imagine what it would have been like for you. Like building from scratch. And it seems like every 3 to 6 weeks, it's like a completely new, I don't know, version of the tape that comes out, and the tactics are just still so malleable. It would be, it's not frustrating, but it's a fast moving ball game, and I don't keep up super well now as an older guy.
Yeah, no, it was definitely unique, and I think that was I think the piece that was the part that was kind of common. I felt like amongst all the guys that were there, particularly at the beginning, and I think I hope now as well was that yes, things are changing so rapidly, and that's what's unique about being part of this program now, and being sort of the old crusty guy that was like, well, this is how we did it when I was your age, is like not helpful, and so
Yeah.
getting into the books and trying to be as credible as you could be, even as whether it was squadron commander or group commander, or part-time dude, whatever it was always about, trying to be good in the airplane, and really having an impact on I think the initial stand up, and the community, and also just the ability to have that impact, and now see it kind of continue to I guess spread across the world with airplanes at Lakenheath and Eielson and Vermont and all that stuff. It's cool to see.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, that's
one
cool.
of the things for everybody who's kind of not in the know. So obviously the F-15A model came out, and then the F-15C model came out, and then I think shortly thereafter the Strike Eagle was coming out, and the Strike Eagle was pretty much the air to ground version. So a lot of the switches and the interface was relatively similar for a while between the F-15C and the F-15E. And then the F-22, these are in general terms, were relatively built off of the interface of a C model. So a lot of the F-22 switchology, or the switches you'll hit, mirror relatively the C model, where the F-16, its fifth gen kind of follow on was the F-35. So an F-16 guy hops into a 35, and some of the TMIS, the certain switches are named the same. They do the same things. And then, so, Merc going from the Strike to the F-16's stealth fighter, and then Bender going from the F-16 to the F-16 stealth fighter. You're like, oh, okay, this kind of makes sense. And I'm doing the opposite. I'm going from the F-16 to the C model, which is probably the switchology, or what we refer to the HOTAS, the hands-on throttle and stick, is very different. The other day I was in the sim and I went to talk. So the F-16, it's your middle finger, and it's or it's an index finger. I don't even remember anymore, but it's like a north-south switch on the front of the throttle. And in the C model, your middle finger moves your axe symbols, not your cursors. But so I would go to talk, and then I'd bump the axe symbols off the top of the screen. So I'm like, cool, I'm on 120 scope now. Thank goodness, and nobody hears the thing I tried to say. And I was like, yeah, this is going to be a challenge. So we've kind of talked previously about the test world. So obviously we have the 422, which is at Nellis, which is operational test. And then we have the 53rd, which is also doing test out at Eglin, also doing operational test, right? But they have embedded DT and OT at Eglin. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so I need a PowerPoint slide or a map or something to kind of drill down on the details of this, and it's so partially accurate, kind of what you said. What I'll start with is a little story about the right start brief in the 53rd Wing that I had when I was a captain at the 422. Okay, so the right start brief at the wing level or whatever, right? Every new person in the organization has to get the right start brief from the wing commander, right? Who has the kind of the spiel of what the wing mission is and that kind of thing. And they open it up for questions at the end, and everybody can kind of air their grievances with the wing commander, potentially, depending on how much risk they want to take. But so I'm at the 422, and I've been there for maybe 6 weeks. And we moved from North Carolina out to Vegas. This was 2008, so it's like at the peak of the kind of the housing crisis and whatnot, and there was a fire sale on houses at in and around Vegas in 2008. But I go to the right start briefing. Like I said, we've been there for about 6 weeks, and I go to a building that I had never been to before to get on a VTC with a person that I had never seen before, who then gave me a briefing about the organization that I had. Like, it's basically, it's the 53rd Wing is spread across somewhere around 26 locations. It really varies, like on a potentially like 6-month basis, depending on what new organization is standing up and what is sunsetting, depending on what assets we're trying to do operational tests and evaluation in. But I walked out of that briefing and I was like, I'm more confused about what it is that we do here now than I was before when I walked in. Because the 422, when you're at Nellis, you kind of see operational tests and evaluation from the seat that you sit in there in test. And there's some test management there at Nellis in the 59th Test and Evaluation Squadron. They do the managing of test and evaluation. So there's engineers and analysts in that squadron that develop, they write test plans, they do test reporting, they schedule range time, they work with the different SPOs in trying to ensure that they're getting the right test points done, that kind of thing. And you see that at Nellis. But what you don't see when you go to Eglin, Eglin is where the 53rd Wing is headquartered at. But there's now 3 groups inside the 53rd Wing. One is headquartered at Eglin. The other one is headquartered at Tyndall, and that's the WEG. So anytime you do any sort of, archer or hammer kind of thing, that's handled out of the WEG, which is the group is at Tyndall. And Bender, you probably see some of that in the 86th but the squadron, the 86th Combat Hammer Squadron, is at Hill. And then the other group is out at Nellis, and that's the TEG. So now I guess, 3 groups in 3 different locations, all doing some semblance of operational tests and evaluation. And what happens at Eglin is you've got, and I'm going to probably leave somebody out. Again, I probably should have had some slides for this. If somebody's just listening to it and they have no idea, or it may be a little bit brutal to try to follow. But the 85th is the operational test flying squadron at Eglin, and that's where Slander was. He flew in the 85th at Eglin. But there's the 85th and the OFP CTF. So Rex Wysack, when he was on before, right? He's in the OFP CTF. And the 85th does the flying portion, if you will, at Eglin for the tests that the OFP CTF manages. But the guys out at Nellis will also do some of that flying. The 422 will also do some of that flying. Then it's probably not valuable actually to go through the list of all the squadrons, but ultimately there's some differences between Nellis and Eglin. But Nellis and Eglin aren't the only 2 locations where we do OT. So there's Edwards, Barksdale, so B-52 test. You've got Dias for B-1 test, Whiteman for B-2 test. I guess all that to say, if you wanted me to talk for the next 30 minutes and sort of build the watch, I could do that. But I think maybe we should close it out and just let you kind of ask some specific questions, and we'll kind of drill down from there.
Well, yeah, and one of the questions I always have is there a division of labor? Obviously, so in all these test organizations, there's different fighter aircraft. There's F-16s, there's F-22s. So at the 422, I think they have every fighter and attack aircraft. So the division of labor there, do they say, hey, we're doing most of our missile shoot testing at this one, and we're doing most of our OFP testing at this one, or our operating systems? Like, how do they break it down, or is it really whoever has the bandwidth?
I think, like the division of labor isn't necessarily perfect, but I think it's probably worth mentioning sort of what operational test is and who controls it at this point, right? So in the 53rd Wing, we do what's called, they do what's called MAGCOM test, right? So they do tests and evaluation for the MAGCOM, for ACC. And what that primarily consists of is tactics development and material solutions for non-ACAT-1 or ACAT-2 programs. Okay, so ACAT-1, just for simplicity, ACAT-1 and ACAT-2 are expensive programs. So what that ends up typically being is, most of the time, an aircraft OFP is at a MAGCOM test level. So something like the OFP CTF, right, is going to do the test management for the MAGCOM, and then the 85th and the 422 are going to go and fly those test points for the OFP CTF. The division of labor loosely, and I don't want to get myself in trouble necessarily, because I think this may have changed, and the 422 commander and the 85th commander now might see things slightly differently. But generally, the 422, because of the access to the Nellis range, does more of the tactics development piece than the 85th does. But it depends on what the test looks like and what resources are required and that kind of thing. And then usually they'll work together to kind of to execute that.
So kind of shifting gears. So obviously we talked very briefly that now you've finished your Air Force career and you retired, and then you started doing consulting. So how does it look kind of from the other side now? So you obviously work on testing stuff, and we work on equipment or products that currently exist. Now, how does that kind of translate into future capes and trying to help onboard those types of things?
Sure. From a consulting standpoint. So I think what was interesting for me was my transition out of the Air Force and into flying airplanes for UPS, after kind of the initial training aspect of it, I found myself with some extra time, right? So even when you're on the road, you're not, you're tasked to fly at certain times, but you're not necessarily busy 100% of the time. And when I'm home, I'm here at Eglin Air Force Base, and I still feel a connection to the warfighter. And so for me, from a consulting standpoint, after I left active duty, I felt like there was still some unfinished business. We had been working on a number of different initiatives for, I don't know how much we've talked about it or how much you've talked about on the podcast, but we were working on a number of different initiatives. So one was data analytics, and we were working with the quick reaction, or the QRIP, I think quick reaction instrumentation pod, and knowledge management, which is sort of honchoed by the data lab out at the 59th out at Nellis. And we were also working on different capabilities and future capabilities in modeling and simulation in a number of different organizations. And for me, I think those two sort of advances in technology over the last, say, decade or so are critical to getting technology to the warfighter more quickly. And so from a consulting standpoint, I sort of just tried to insert myself, if you will, to kind of into, okay, how can I help the warfighter solve, these problems by bringing, I guess, relevant members of industry to the table and seeing maybe where where things make sense. And so that's how I got hooked up with Julian and Crowdbotics Vader. And so if you can see kind of how that came full circle, because obviously they're doing some great work, and recently had some good wins, and I'd love to see them continue to provide value for the warfighter, because I think they're the company capable of doing it.
Well, I think a lot of we talked with the CEO Brian Stream from Vermeer a couple weeks back, and that episode recently dropped, and he was under the impression that like anything the private sector has, the military already has. He's like, oh, if we have this tech, I can only imagine what the government has. And I think the other way. I'm like, oh, if I have this, think what you could buy off the shelf, and I think that's what a lot of companies don't even realize, that do we capture data? Tons of it. Do we use any of it? None of it. Very little of it. I won't say none. And that's where like a Crowdbotics shows up and says like, yeah, we'll analyze all your data that you currently do nothing with. And you're like, yeah, totally. But the problem is them just understanding that we need that capability,
Yeah, 100%. I think the other challenge too is the just the process by which we go about acquiring things is it's not necessarily overly agile. I mean, there's certain agile. That's a nice way of putting it, right? There are certain agile mechanisms, right? I think we've talked before about SIBRs and different phases, right? And those are maybe agile mechanisms. There's different advances that we've made with things like they call it middle tier acquisition, but essentially fast tracking acquisition programs. But for the most part, I mean, it's a long and bureaucratic process. And so, I think, a lot of people's paradigm may be that yeah, the military has the best stuff because they're thinking, I don't know, military grade X, whatever it is. If you rewind the clock, like, maybe 40 years ago, that might, military grade steel or something, right? You're like, okay, cool, maybe that's great. But I mean, if you were to say like military grade data analytics, like, oh, like that actually means something pretty terrible.
Yeah, please
compared
no.
to, yeah, exactly, or at least from the seat that I've sat in. There may be something that's happening, behind the scenes at a high level, particularly in the intelligence community, where it is fascinating. But for like you said, for the data that we gather from a sortie generation standpoint, I mean, just across not only the flying aspect of things, but also the maintenance aspect, like there's so much information, and our analytics of it, at least what I've seen, is probably rudimentary at best. It's somebody's like fancy Excel sheet potentially.
Yeah. Well, and
Can you go into?
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Vader. I was going to ask, can you give us for the audience kind of a specific example of the kind of data that you're working with? I don't know if it's either too in the weeds or maybe it's, I assume not all is classified, but when we talk about the stuff that the Air Force misses or doesn't use, like, it's a lot of data. So like, what kind of stuff are you working with?
Yeah. So I think just like at a very high level, right? The product that Julian and Crowdbotics have put together is a data analytics tool, and what they did was they got a SIBR. They synced up with Seymour Johnson for a SIBR, and what they were able to do is basically capture TISP data off of the aircraft, and then recreate that flight using the TISP data, so time, space, position, instrumentation, right? So it's basically just recording the GPS. But what they were able to do then is aggregate that. So that in and of itself, in my opinion, is like somewhat interesting, maybe, right? Because we have the capability to do that across multiple different platforms already. But what they're able to do is aggregate that data and then data mine it afterwards. So the one sortie is sort of interesting, right? But when you take an individual's or potentially an aircraft's data and you aggregate that over weeks, months, years, potentially, an entire career, now you have a data story to tell, whether it's over G's on the structural integrity of the airplane, or it's an individual's ability to do something like a I don't know, A/B loop or threat reaction or whatever it is. But that's the kind of data that it's sort of captured in a silo right now, and it's not necessarily aggregated, and I think has multiple use cases across test, training, safety, a number of a number of different areas. And I think it's just right now, I think it's a little bit sometimes the challenge is getting synced up with sustainment, right, with the acquisition side, and something that can really ensure that a product like this or this capability lasts for a long period of time, as opposed to gets SIBR phase 2 and then sort of fizzles out after that.
I think.
Yeah, I think that's.
Oh, go ahead.
Super. Sorry, I'll let you go back here a second, but so for the F-35, I think, and the F-16, I think for all fighters it's pretty similar. But the F-35 obviously uses, the tactics are very three-dimensional, if you will. And it's a little bit different than what I was used to in the Viper. But the same, I think the Viper and the F-35, and probably all fighters have the same kind of issue. Like, we're pretty good at getting the data from a single sortie that a four-ship flies and digging into it and maybe finding a couple lessons learned. But I think we're pretty bad, or at least one of our shortfalls is being able to spread that information to other four ships. So we try to do it by posting lessons learned or talking at pilot meetings. But like you're saying, like the ability to have the real truth data of like what one four ship experiences as far as like, like where they shoot or what they're doing with their altitude when they shoot, or, all these specific, pieces of data that we kind of miss. If you could aggregate that all across, a squadron's training cycle for a year, and then identify things that a four ship would never have seen, or that a squadron would never have known that they all do a certain thing, you know what I mean? And then be able to like reincorporate that back in to the training cycle, or even to the 422, like, hey, test this, out or whatever. I mean, that's all just missed opportunity right now.
100%. I mean, so I think what's interesting is that, at least in the fighter community, I think so much of our capturing of lessons learned and our debriefs are focused on tape review, right? And we come back and we talk about truth data. I mean, there's tape review, but there's also, ICADS or ACMI or whatever kind of, version that you're using. But a lot of it is based off of kind of what you see visually, right? And what you can discern visually. And the reality of it is that, yes, maybe 20 years ago, that was as much data as we were able to collect, because that's what we had for data collection capability. And 20 years later, there's so much more data that can now be captured and analyzed and used to really determine truth data, and particularly when we're talking about, the electromagnetic spectrum, the IR spectrum, there's a lot of things that you can't necessarily just see and debrief to, right? So I think that the argument for data analytics I think it's an easy one. It's really about kind of determining, okay, how do we inject this, and really now, how do we revolutionize and how do we incorporate this into training, tactics development, like I said, safety aspects, maintenance, all that, all the kind of the different, I guess, use cases for it.
I think one of the things that I saw, because I too was chatting with Crowdbotics while I was doing innovation, while I was on the active duty side, and every time you sit down with operators and leadership and everyone, and Crowdbotics says, this is what we do, everybody's like, I totally get it. Like exactly what Bender said. Like, hey, I heard about this technology. I immediately think of ways to use it. And when I think of it, I think of people, some people who aren't kind of on the end user side, they don't realize, like, wait, so you already capture TISP data. Why do you need to capture TISP data? Again, it's not that we're recapturing the same thing. It's not that our data, it's the analytics and the long-term understanding of what's happening is the big deal. Or it's like academics. Yeah, it's like academics. Like, oh, we already have an academic structure, and no. This is adaptive learning. Like, this is not the master question file that you review before your closed book testing or whatever. Like, it is analyzing you as an individual and feeding you questions that will help you to stay as smart as possible. And data analytics is the same way. You can break it down by a person. This guy or this pilot has an issue with these things, or we already know via safety reports and safety analytics over decades, most times you have a class A, there is going to be 1 to 2 to 3 little things. A guy's going to land long and fast and he's going to pop a tire, or a guy's going to have a hot start that he didn't notice because he's not paying attention. And all that, like, they know you're going to see 2 or 3 of these things, and then you're going to have a class A, or you're going to lose a jet. And what you end up finding is, like, we already know these things. And if we're running analytics day in and day out, then the analytics say, you need to be careful. Like, the special interest item will come out before the class A, not after. And so that's the stuff that I'm like, I can't imagine why you wouldn't want that. And especially in new planes that we're onboarding now. So a T7 is a perfect example. You could get data analytics from the day it runs off of the factory line to the end of that aircraft's life for every student that flies it, every sortie that plane flies, and truly understand better the iron and the products that come out of that iron. So I'm flabbergasted when it's not an automatic.
No, so this is why I'm involved in it, right? Because, I look at it really kind of trying to connect the dots between what I hear leaders in the Air Force saying, right? And the overall sort of, strategy from the highest levels of government when you like, so to tie this back to, even, like I said, like the highest levels of government, the National Defense Strategy says that one of the things that we need to do essentially is to get technology to the warfighter more quickly, right? And I look at, like, okay, well, how? do we go about doing that? Because I think saying those things, right, and saying things like accelerate, change, or lose, and saying things like Colonel Bradley just came out with, who's the 53rd Wing Commander, with a paper that says that we need to accelerate, test, or lose. I think it's important to not only say those things, but to come up with processes that enable that to actually happen. And I look at data analytics as a key enabler to ensuring that we can meet, you know, uh, those challenges. And so, and again, that's I'm passionate about it. You know, ultimately, I think it's consequential for the warfighter, and I can see a reason to try to connect these dots. And so that's how I, you know, got into doing this.
Yeah, and one question I had, so I've heard not mixed reviews, but I've heard different things. So as a innovation person, so obviously we have some innovators, you know, that listen. We have some innovation leads like Spark Cells on the show. And sometimes people are hesitant to kind of push their innovation that they're working with, their Crowdbotics or their Vermeers or whatever company they're working with, to their next level of leadership. Would you say when you were kind of the group commander, would you want that to kind of bubble up to your level and then beyond? Because in my understanding, that's the only way these companies are going to go anywhere beyond a SBIR 2.
Yeah, 100%. So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if they don't make it to the you know, beyond the squadron commander level, to the group commander level, to the wing commander, and eventually to the MAGCOM, it the institution isn't necessarily designed well for money to flow to innovation at the kind of the operational end user experience, right? So most of the money, in fact, all of the money that flows to a traditional wing is O&M dollars, right? It's 3,400 money, which means that, and that 3,400 money or operations and maintenance dollars is sort of like keep the lights on type of money, which is all based off, I mean, that's the whole like why we fly out, or why some organizations fly out their flying hour program, you know, why you've seen certain organizations go out and buy flat screen TVs at the end of the year or whatever it is, right? Like it's all based off of O&M funding, and that O&M funding is pretty much just based off of the funding that you got from the previous year, right? And so if innovators are scratching and clawing for those dollars inside of a traditional wing, there's not a lot of like spare change in the couch necessarily, right? Like the dollars exist outside of the execution. I would say just primarily, if the money exists outside of 3,400 money, or outside of operations and maintenance type of money, and in acquisition. And so if you're the end user and you're working with these Crowdbotics or, you know, other companies out there, and you're like, man, what they are bringing to the table is, you know, is life changing, or could be life changing, or at least is somewhat value added, the conversation has to kind of go up and out the chain to the MAGCOM, or you know, potentially the HAF, to kind of determine how to get it funded.
Yeah, and I think.
Can I ask a question on
yeah.
that? Unless you're going to, Vader.
But, no, hit it, Bender.
So Vader's more. He's been right in the as an innovation lead, so he understands a little bit better than I do. But from our conversations we have with some people, you know, we talk SPOs, so program managers and people like that. Can you? And that's so some of the advice we'd be getting and giving to innovation companies is like that. That's who you ultimately need to connect with, right? Is the people who control like what happens in this airframe, or where money is put where for this airframe's purpose, if that makes sense. So is that acquisition type money to like do SPOs, or what is the, I guess can you define kind of that space for us and how that interacts with acquisition versus O&M money and that kind of thing?
Yeah, 100%. So I'm not necessarily a congressional budget expert, right? I haven't spent any time on the Hill, but my understanding of how that plays out, right, is there's essentially 3,400 money, like we talked about, is the operations and maintenance dollars, and then you have 3,600 money, which is um, more test evaluation and sort of programmatic type of money, and that is allocated slightly differently than your O&M funds. They call it 2-year money. You may have heard that term before as well. But those $3,600 flow to programs to acquire things, right? And so there's, I think the advice, and that's, as I've been talking um, with other companies as well, ultimately, sustainment dollars or sort of long-term programmatic dollars ensure, more of a transition to, from this small business innovative research to small business innovative research, and then really what everybody's trying to get to is the sort of R&D type of phase, right? To the research and development piece, because just the research aspect of it is sort of, I think, interesting. Companies still want to be doing consequential work, but really getting kind of crossing the quote unquote valley of death there and getting to development is kind of is where companies are trying to get to. And so yeah, my take on it is that being involved with and kind of trying to enter into organizations that have access to $3,600 is a kind of a more viable strategy.
Yeah, I think that's one of the tough parts, because I think a lot of people run into people who want the product but don't have the funding available. Even you go to ACC and they say, we like it, but we don't have any dollars for it. One of the things we talked to Emily Murphy, who used to be the Bender, maybe you remember, but she was the pretty much like the director
of the
GSA.
the GSA.
Yeah, so she was knowledgeable, and she said like, hey, you can at the end of the year kind of like pick up any swept up money, random dollars like that. So we've also said like, hey, I don't know if that money can go to innovation versus big screen TVs, but I sure hope it can. So that's one of the things I think is tough, is if you're not using the SBIR 1, SBIR 2 process, it's tough to actually find people who can write you a check and get that product onboarded in a commercialization type way.
Yeah, and it makes I wonder, like, how does the end user, like Vader or I, or you, when you were finding it, like, how do you get that message to the $3,600? You know what I mean? Like, where's the connection? Is it Wing Commanders meet with certain program managers every once in a while? Or like, how does that even, how do we get there, I guess, from an end user's perspective? If I'm trying to like make something across the ACC, like, this is a great program, I want to ACC wide.
I think uh, um, I think what we're kind of uncovering here, right, is like is sort of a institutional sort of process challenge, right? Because the institution, I would say, isn't necessarily well designed for sort of a bottom up approach, right? And I think that's part of the challenge with some of the implementation of innovation across the DoD, at least in my experience, has been there's maybe a little bit of a lack of direction, and sort of it's a, hey, you're going to be the innovation cell lead, I want you to think like a garage startup kind of thing, right? And you're like, well, what does that even mean, right? Like, am I gonna, do I have, should I be going after some kind of VC backing? Should I be expecting some kind of funding rounds? Like do I need to be worried about my equity set up in my company kind of thing? We don't have, I think, the process well defined to say, okay, with this innovation cell, this is what I expect to see with as far as results are concerned. I think, to answer your question about how the process currently works, right, is there's a process at a very high level across the DoD to do things like acquisition of major programs, which is, the JSIDS process, which you might have heard about. But essentially, in that process, it's a look across the all of the different services to say, where are our capability gaps, and then a look to try to fill those capability gaps with major acquisition programs. But that's not what we're talking about here, right? So when we talk about innovation from the bottom up, I think it's a challenge to figure out, how to cross this quote unquote valley of death, because the process itself isn't well designed to be able to say, okay, I have this innovation cell and this is where I'm going to go from research to development.
Yeah, and I think there's some part of the valley of death that's always going to exist. Like Cyber 1s are going to be the most prevalent, and not every company that gets a Cyber 1 is going to go to a Cyber 2, and Cyber 2s aren't going to all make Cyber 3s. So I understand there's going to be a level of attrition, but the thing that I struggle with is when we have attrition due to lack of understanding or lack of an ability to actually connect the right people. Because I think you're exactly right. You get thrown into the seat for maybe 6 to 9 months, and you may figure it out right as you're leaving, which is pretty standard for most of my jobs in the military. But when it's this large, they say, hey, you need a good acquisitions officer, you need a good finance person. But if you don't have those, then whether, it's just, it didn't work out or you didn't find them, that's where it becomes difficult to actually get anything across the line, Yeah.
And I think, so I guess from my vantage point, right? What I'm trying to do is take a look at sort of some of the challenges, that existed in test while I was in that position that I know still exist, and go out to industry to say, hey, is there somebody out there that can help to solve this challenge, and then bring those people together. Again, that's a little bit of a grassroots kind of effort. But so far it's been, I think, value added for the warfighter and ultimately, like I said, consequential. So I don't know that that's the right way to do it necessarily, but it's a way that I've found to do it so far.
Yeah, Bender and I have had that conversation a lot, because I think there are a lot of people out there who could create some amazing solutions. They just don't know that they are problems. Oop. I think we lost him. Hey, Merc, welcome back. But yeah, I think one of the things that Bender and I were talking about while you had some connectivity issues was that it's great that there's people like yourself and other people that we've talked to out there trying to help bridge that gap, because we've seen so many times where we have an end user knows a problem and there's somebody out there that can solve it, and there's just no way to get those two people together, or no known way, outside of you just having a network that you can connect. And that's kind of why this podcast became reality, was because I struggled to understand this, and my knowledge when I left was about 10% of what it is now of the space. And I've learned more and more that I was woefully unprepared to actually do anything of substance as an end user trying to stand up a Spark cell and trying to get Cybers, because the reality is I didn't know enough to even be that helpful. So hopefully, the work you're doing and the work, hopefully the podcast is doing some goodness to help make more companies kind of bridge that gap and become useful products that end users gain benefit from.
Yeah, 100%, man. I think the podcast it's a great way to do it, kind of spread the word, right? And ultimately, I think, your audience consists of end users of these products, right? The warfighter, and also industry, right? And so, ultimately, that's kind of the space that I'm running in as well, right? Between, providing value to the warfighter, industry and technology, and kind of trying to merge those things together and, provide a benefit to not only to the warfighter, but to national defense. So I think the podcast is a great way to do it.
Well, thank you. Well, Merc, thank you again for joining us on the show. Do you have a email for your consulting, or any way someone can reach out if they are looking to get some input from you or work with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So Greg at franaconsulting.com. So pretty easy there. Otherwise, reach out on LinkedIn as well. That works. And yeah, always happy to have conversations with, whether it's people making the transition out of the military, trying to figure out where to land and what they want to do and how to provide value, or if it's industry wanting to reach out to figure out where to connect and how to navigate through some of this stuff. Happy to have those conversations.
That's great. Yeah, we'll have his email in the show notes too if you want to find it there. And thank you again for coming on the show. We appreciate it.
Yeah, right on. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
This is great.
Thanks, Merc.
Appreciate it.